Introduction. The chasm between modern clinic and basic science is very much highlighted by the recent developments in the field of psychiatry. Progress in understanding the brain has not been mirrored in improved clinical outcomes. Most current therapies with some efficacy emerged decades ago. Delivery in the department of new techniques of treatment have not been adequate by any means. Either it has led to not so useful outcomes when the post-treatment results of patients were analysed, or they impacted the tested patients with such adverse and severe after-effects that they were forced to render ineffective. Research on brain mechanisms engaged during confrontations with threats, stimuli, with the potential to inflict harm to the organisms has shown high degrees of conversation for conditions involving alterations in threat processing, especially the so-called anxiety disorder. We argue that this state of affairs reflects how fear and anxiety have been conceived, and we offer a new framework to address the problem. For long, scientists and doctors had been advocating the existence of a so-called innate fear system in all of mammalian brains, which when cornered or threatened, they bring up the feeling of fear and psychological responses as well as behavioral, which are very usual of such experiences. But to us, this looks better if a two-systems framework is brought into being, one set for producing conscious feelings, while the other one just to control physiological and behavioral feedbacks and responses to any form of threat that is encountered. Out of the two systems devised above, the first primarily engages the cortical areas of the brain, whereas the second system employs the subcortical regions to execute it, such as the amygdala, to be exact, even though a little bit of the cortical areas also interact with and regulate processing in these regions. Conflation of these circuits and their functions has hampered clinical extension of basic research. While the actual circuitry is considerably more complex than implied by the two-system label, the framework represents a useful heuristic around which to restructure translational efforts to achieve a deeper, more nuanced understanding than currently exists about how brain mechanisms give rise to normal and pathological feelings which resemble of anxiety or fear. Terminology briefings. The terms anxiety and fear are applied in many different ways. Let's first consider fear. Most often, it refers to a subjective state, a feeling that one experiences when threatened. However, it also describes behaviors such as facial expressions, freezing, flight, and avoidance, as well as psychological changes that accompany such behaviors. Using the same term for both subjective states and objective responses implies that they are entwined in a common neutral circuit. We and others argue that this assumption is incorrect. The different processes referred to by the term fear reflect different mechanisms rather than operations of one fear center or fear circuit. Because precise terminology is essential for scientific progress, we propose that the use of mental state terms, like fear and anxiety, be limited to their primary, as against their extended meanings. Its job can be more appropriately viewed as detecting and responding to present or imminent threats. The amygdala functions in creating the fear, though indirectly, but it shouldn't be seen, as the innate fear center contributes to fear indirectly, but shouldn't be taken as an innate fear center which allows fear to percolate. And the BNCT is not itself responsible for the experience of anxiety, but instead is a key part of an innate defense circuit that detects and processes uncertain threats. The BNCT contributes to anxiety indirectly in the way that the amygdala contributes indirectly to fear. Consequences of its activation generate signals that modulate circuits which actually generate certain feelings, such as anxiety or even fear. The emergence of conscious experience from cortical circuits. Neuroscience research has recorded substantial progress in the areas of neural and cognitive underpinnings of different past memories. This work assumes that conscious experience is cognitively derived from non-conscious processes that allow cortical regions to re-represent lower-order information, and that this re-representation enables conscious awareness of non-conscious processing about external stimuli. We propose that subjective feelings of fear or anxiety are not products of subcortical circuits underlying defensive responses, but instead depend on the same circuits that underlie any other form of conscious experience, namely, circuits in the so-called higher-order association cortex that are responsible for cognitive processes such as attention and working memory. Included are areas of the lateral and medial prefrontal cortex, as well as the parietal neocortex. The lateral prefrontal areas may be especially important since they have been most consistently implicated in conscious awareness, are interconnected with the other key cortical areas, are particularly well developed in primates, and have unique attributes in humans. The insula, another frontal region, has been implicated in the conscious experience of somatic sensations and may be particularly relevant to threats signaled by perturbations in the organism's psychologic milieu and in forms of anxiety initiated by interoceptive stimuli. In global workspace theory, subjective experience emerges through widely distributed reentrant circuity, with prefrontal areas playing an especially prominent part. In higher-order theory, subjective experience arises from a more delimited circuity, especially involving a prefrontal hub, which supports thoughts about lower-order information. Chapter 1. Neural Network. Two of the best developed and most widely used cognitive architectures are SAW and ACT-R. ACT-R stands for Adaptive Control of Thought, Rational. The latter has been used extensively in psychology and is the one we will focus on here. We will consider first what is meant by the term cognitive architecture and then examine how ACT-R relates to the production system ideas that we have introduced above. Then we will look at getting a working version of ACT-R installed on our own computer, explore an introductory tutorial, and build our own simple version of the rock-paper-scissors game in ACT-R. Despite their similarities, SAW and ACT-R have a fundamental difference. SAW is about intelligence per se, intelligence stripped of its biological implementation. Biology may provide examples of intelligent systems, but for SAW, the goal is to create a general intelligence, not to understand human intelligence. ACT-R is concerned with the latter task. Human data serve not only as the source of ideas for ACT-R, but also as important constraints. It is possible for ACT-R to be too intelligent. This is not true for SAW. This distinction should not be overdone. Both SAW and ACT-R draw inspiration from Simon and Newell's early ideas about how to model general problem solving. While ACT-R's recent implementations put a great deal of effort into biological plausibility, the origins of ACT-R were more psychological than neurological. What is a cognitive architecture? The answer to this question lies in considering the conjunction of its elements. Architecture should bring to mind blueprints and building. It is a specification. It outlines what the pieces are and how they go together. But the term also has the connotation of physical components. Cognition brings to mind thinking, deliberating over facts, making decisions, solving problems. Specifying a cognitive architecture requires that we give some details to both terms, architecture and cognition. To be an architecture, one has to declare what the components are functionally speaking. What are the processing elements? Are the processing elements the nodes of a connectionist network, or are they the structures of a production system? Either answer is accepted as part of the specifications led by its architecture. To be a cognitive architecture, one needs to specify what cognition means, or at least give a few well-chosen examples of the class. Commonly, these are higher-order psychological concepts like memory or reasoning. When you specify both the domain of application, that is cognition, and the mechanisms of execution that cognize, then you have specified a cognitive architecture. To reveal a little rhetorical flourish, a cognitive architecture is a specification for thought. ACT-R is motivated by this idea, which is why its creator, John Anderson, wrote a script called The Architecture of Cognition. A brief sketch of ACT-R. Currently, ACT-R is more noun than acronym. As you might imagine, before there was an ACT-R, there was an ACT. The software for ACT-R is now up to version 6.0, and ACT-R has undergone a great deal of change over its 40-year life. Despite these changes, ACT-R remains consistent in some very important ways. ACT-R views knowledge as being largely of two types: declarative and procedural. This emphasis on procedural and declarative processes demonstrates ACT-R's origin as a model of human memory. Declarative knowledge is facts and figures. For example, there are 7 continents. 2 + 1 is 3. Procedural knowledge is how you do something. It is the variety of knowledge that encapsulates productions. For example, if this is true, then you do that. We know from studies of brain injury that focal cerebral damage can cause isolated functional impairments. This suggests that the brain is composed of modules that run in parallel, and this is a major architectural feature of ACT-R. The modules are not arbitrary, but are specified based on empirical results in human psychology. The only modules we will deal with are ACT-R, on empirical results in human psychology. The only modules we will deal with are the declarative and procedural, but ACT-R has modules for vision and motor behavior, among others. The software that implements ACT-R is sufficiently flexible to allow for the development of new modules that users might need and can justify. A byproduct of the modularity of ACT-R is that there needs to be some way for the contents of the various modules to interact. ACT-R implements such a system via buffers. The contents of modules can be selected and placed into a module-specific buffer. The size of the buffers is specified in chunks, and the number of chunks per buffer is limited, motivated by the classic claim that human short-term memory can maintain. While we can only keep a few items or chunks active in our working memory, that is, our declarative memory buffer, we can keep a virtually unlimited number of facts in our long-term store. ACT-R enforces the limits by tracking chunks, their types, and their contents. The contents of the various modules are parceled into pigeonholes called slots. The operations of an ACT-R simulation are cyclic. At any given time, there is a goal and buffers of relevant modules are probed. Based on the contents of the buffers, the procedural system searches its library of rules for all applicable holdings. After the matching step, the procedural says how long a computer program takes to complete is its runtime. But the computer may have another clock that converts processing stages and operations into the amount of time that it is thought they would take if being performed by a biological system. This time is called simulated time. TEM selects one production for firing. If more than one rule is in the running, then there is a system of conflict resolution. When a production is set to fire, it means that the right-hand side is invoked. The right-hand side is the then part of the if-then rule. The contents of this if-then rule can be wide. The goal could be changed as a result of the production's action, or requests could be made to various modules to change or clear their buffer contents. Once the production has completed its activities, the cycle repeats. Repetition continues until there is nothing left to do. In practice, the software that implements ACT-R limits these stages to a single step, a specified number of steps, or a specified period of simulated time. In fact, there are a few different flavors that you can try. There are versions of ACT-R written in the Java 1 programming language and the Python 2 language. Both versions are true to the spirit of ACT-R and represent faithful implementations that adapt to their respective programming languages. They are adequate for anything that a beginner would want to do, but neither is the canonical program. If you know either Java or Python, then you should consider starting with one of these 10 versions and leveraging your existing expertise. If you know neither of those programming languages, you might as well download the original version. 3 ACT-R version 6.0 is written in Lisp. Lisp is one of the oldest programming languages, and has a long history of use by those interested in the computational aspects of cognition and AI. However, because it comes from a tradition of hackers and free thinkers, the standardization and support are fragmented. Fortunately, you need to know almost no Lisp at all to begin to use ACT-R as a tool for exploration, but you would need to learn some Lisp to explore the research potential of ACT-R. ACT-R provides standalone versions that do not require having Lisp installed on your computer. Because of this, the standalone versions are easier to install and to begin to use. But because they are incomplete and because they shield you from the implementation, they do not give you the full power of ACT-R. For example, code written in MATLAB will require a working version of MATLAB, which will cost you money, but a model written in MATLAB can still make its source files available for inspection. Getting Lisp is not as easy as getting other programming languages because there is no single approved version. Fortunately, there is an accepted standard, and almost all modern Lisps respect this standard, ANSI. Consequently, they are sufficiently interoperable that you can compile and run ACT-R using any one of them. Given Lisp's electric background, there is more NIX, an abbreviation used for all Unix and Linux-like operating systems in all their various flavors. Not all of these have the NIX suffix, for example FreeBSD. This is because most Linux operating systems will have a package management system for the installation of software packages. It is possible to set up a Windows or Mac OS X computer to also be able to run Linux, but while it may be easier to get Lisp installed on a Linux system, it involves strength of character, patience, and lots of perseverance due to the difficulty in the task involved. Which Lisp? Steel, Bank, Common Lisp 4 and Clisp 5 are widely used Lisp versions that are freely available and will work well for you. They can be more convenient when paired with QuickLisp 6, a Lisp library manager which simplifies getting and installing Common Lisp packages for Common Lisp variants. However, if you do not have experience in doing these kinds of free-form installations, then I suggest you remember the old age. You get what you pay for. LispWorks is a for-profit company that maintains a version of Lisp that installs and works and comes with necessary libraries. It also offers support for its products. If you envision using Lisp for business or as a major part of a research platform, LispWorks would be an excellent choice. We can take 11 advantages of the fact that the company behind LispWorks is a generous supporter of education and provides a free personal version. This program is limited in its capabilities, but it is an excellent platform for becoming familiar with Lisp without having to worry about installation or maintenance issues. The LispWorks personal version will be all that we will need for running ACT-R. The LispWorks Personal Edition is found through the company's website. Chapter 2. Neuropsychology and Impact. Neurophysiology of self-initiated action and the implications for the understanding of free will over the past 30 years, experiments investigating the brain activity associated with voluntary decisions to perform a simple movement have been widely reported to undermine the notion of free will. As should be evident, there are certain complexities in designing an experiment in which you seek to conduct neuroscientific measurements that are linked to an apparently spontaneous action on the part of the research subject. How can a scientist with appropriate instrumentation be on hand to measure a truly voluntary act? If a volunteer is connected to your electrophysiology apparatus, how can they be expected to demonstrate genuine spontaneity? And how can they indicate the timing of their conscious will to act relative to the brain signals that might be recorded when consciousness is an internal phenomenon shielded from an observer? The potential limitations regarding transfer of the findings of lab-based research into real-life contexts, the so-called ecological validity problem, is one to which we will return in the next section when we consider the appropriateness of legal application of genetic and neuroscientific data. In the meantime, it is necessary to discuss some key experiments looking at the timing and location within the brain for various apparently volitional actions. Electroencephalography studies. Even though he was not known to be the first ever to have worked on the said topic, but a very interesting and important study was completed by the scientist known as Benjamin Libet and his colleagues. Their results appear to show brain activation before the participant has made a conscious decision to act. His novel contribution was to develop a means whereby the research subject had some autonomy over when to trigger a response, in this case a 12 short, sharp movement of the right hand, and to report with some accuracy the time at which they were conscious of the intent to do so. The participant was asked to look at a clock, actually a bright dot moving around the edge of an oscilloscope tube, and know the time at which they had decided to start. Significantly, the research subjects themselves were free to choose how long after the initial setup they waited to perform the hand movement, so the timing was seemingly voluntary. The self-reported awareness of the time at which participants wanted to move was validated using a second series of recordings in which the subject reported the time at which they were given a small electrical stimuli by the researchers. For comparison, the participants were also required to perform the same hand movement at a preset time on the clock. Libet's experiment, consistently brought forward in the limelight, which was also repeated by many others subsequently as well, is the invention of an electrical signal termed the readiness potential, RP, or Bereshart's potential. The RP starts a second or two before the time of awareness to want to move, which is referred to as W. W, in turn, precedes the actual movement, M, by several hundred milliseconds. Studies involving brain imaging. More recently, researchers have been able to apply emerging techniques such as PET and fMRI to place in front of everyone concerned the very same questions again and again regarding the timing and the place within the brain in particular when a self-determined movement is intended. All the relevant experiments that were conducted so far to find this out are pointing to the cerebral cortex, or more specifically to the supplementary motor area within it. Attempts to identify the location of activity more finely within the SMA have generated some disagreement, though authors have frequently drawn attention to the importance of the most anterior section, often termed the pre-SMA, in preparation for voluntary action. Investigations at the neuronal level. It is said that no individual method for studying the neuroscience of cognition is perfect, especially when it comes to the EEG-based experiments, which are accused of lacking the precision to trace the physical location of the signals, and at the same time fMRI-based tests lacks accuracy in predicting the exact timing of certain events. Additional information can come from investigations at the level of individual neurons. However, the invasive nature of such work, it involves placing electrodes within the brain, means that studies of that kind have, for the most part, been restricted to animal models. These types of experiments suffer from other complexities. Added to that, there is always a lot of difficulties in conducting such tests on humans rather than on primates, as that is thought to be not very ethical. Secondly, it's not possible to request the subject to report the exact timing of the intention if the test subject is not human. Rare 13 opportunities to conduct research on human brains do arise under circumstances in which the tissue has been accessed for another primary goal. The experiments involved people who already had electrodes implanted deep into their brains as part of treatment for forms of epilepsy that had proven unresponsive to pharmaceutical interventions. Their studies found the first measurable neuron-level events took place in the supplementary motor areas, SMA, of the cerebral hemispheres. That is very much in line with that of the earliest data collected. The authors are appropriately cautious about the dangers of overinterpretation of their results. They note that the positioning of the electrodes was determined by the situational needs of the patients depending upon their clinical condition, but was not due to research priorities. It is therefore feasible that an even earlier signal might have been developed in a different region of the brain, undetected by their study. In a task for which participants were given a choice of two activities, addition or subtraction of two numbers, the researchers were able to tell which choice is made by a thorough analysis of its response pattern within the medial prefrontal cortex of the subject just before it executes the decision. Timing of this kind would be well beyond any criticism that self-reporting of intention is sufficiently inaccurate to create a spurious RP effect. It seems therefore that whatever the brain signals preceding conscious intention actually mean, they are nonetheless genuine. Philosophical and moral implications of these experiments. For present purposes, then, the issue is not so much the details concerning which areas of the brain are exactly responsible for producing the RP, but more so with the consequences and the impact of the readiness potential phenomenon when observed and analysed for a substantial time span. However, few of the scholars and scientists contest both the significance and the meaning of Libet's data and the significance placed upon them by philosophers. One of the noted scientists working in this field, Roskies, who suggested through her research of Libet-style experiments that there could be a connection in between the movement-based response and the RP, since the former is the trigger to the collection of data. There may be, she argues, individual RP events that are not associated with movement which are simply not reported due to the way that the experiments have been developed. Although the vast majority of traces proved predictably difficult to read by eye, they found 50 that appear to have a clear RP and a further 50 that had very low noise, but also lacked an RP. Averaging these two populations of data separately confirm the perception that a subpopulation of Libet-style recordings actually have no RP. It may be, they argue, that far from being an initial indication of conscious action, the RP is revealing that the participant is expecting something to happen. Roskies thinks that identification of the source of a signal is not accurately possible with the electroencephalography method. I am not fully persuaded by this 14 argument. The spatial limitations of electromagnetic measurements are well known, but can be overcome by employing different methods. Her philosophical concerns are, I think, of greater merit. Firstly, she notes that the setup of Libet's experiments, and here we could also include the majority of work done in a similar fashion, are actually measuring when to move, not whether to move. This is a relatively trivial question compared with the broader interpretations that have been attributed to these studies. This is not, she continues, an issue that is massively taxing for the conscious will. It is more equivalent to a man deciding to put his trousers on left leg before his right leg, waking up one fine morning instead of his eventual decision flash or red light, just as not to be late for school or work, and that is followed by a deadly accidental collision at the railway's tracks crossing. I can accept that the RP for a finger movement precedes conscious awareness of an intention to move, she concludes, and still deny that this has much to say about whether or not we are free in the cases and contexts in which freedom really does matter. Next, Roskies also observed that the Libet method of experiments is too demanding for participants, as they need to be extremely alert in order to be attentive to both internal willingness to move, as well as external clock signals at the same time. This may be problematic in terms of the processing of information. Furthermore, what is actually being measured at time W is not conscious intent, but consciousness of conscious intent, which is, potentially, a very different phenomenon. In real life, he points out, a particular action may stem from a very long period of deliberation. Chapter 3. Nomenclature. In scientific literatures as well as clinical practices, generally different classes of medications are referred by their names which are based on the indication, for e.g. antipsychotic, antidepressant, hypnotic, anxiolytic, stimulant or mood stabilizer, etc., etc. This was published in 1976 for the very first time ever and is also significantly used by WHO, with the help of WHO Collaborating Center for Drug Statistics Methodology. It is not surprising that the term psychoanaleptic is neither used nor understood, with its meaning for exert a stimulating effect on the mind. The further grouping by antidementia, antidepressant, psychostimulants and combinations is partly by indication and partly by imprecise drug action. This level of classification represents in part a combination of structure and indication, such as for the TCAs, tricyclic antidepressants. Doctor, is my situation so bad that you give me antipsychotics? Although particular drugs are correctly used for different diagnoses, situations in which the drug names do not match the clinical conditions for which they were prescribed may instill doubts in patients about their use. It obviously does not provide relevant pharmacological anchors to assist clinicians in making informed choices, neither for the first nor for subsequent pharmacological steps when switching, augmenting, or combining is needed. Finally, the current nomenclature has proved a fertile ground for creative use of language to market new compounds. For psychiatric diagnosis, this would be comparable to using the DSM-2 or ICD-6. Hence, it is no wonder that key and significant concepts and findings in neuroscience were not brought in. As an example, imopramine is classified as an antidepressant, since its additional therapeutic benefit in panic disorder was discovered 16 years after it was accepted for depression. These pharmacological domains reflect current knowledge and understanding regarding the neurotransmitters or molecules or systems that are modified. In relation to these pharmacological domains, it is recognized that drugs can have actions on more than one system. In those cases, the relevant domains will be specified in a hierarchical order. To test the usefulness of the NBN in scientific publications, the task force decided to translate to NBN nomenclature 2 recent articles use the earlier versions of naming. Group terminology such as antipsychotics, neuroleptics, major tranquilizers, antidepressants, anxiolytics, hypnotics, mood stabilizers and stimulants turns out to be more challenging than translating specific medications. To address this matter, the task force developed a glossary. The glossary has 2 goals. A. To ensure smooth transition of group terms from the former terminology to NBN, and B. To assist author or clinicians or lecturers in using precise terminology. For example, if a medication for anxiety, the former term anxiolytic, is mentioned, does it refer to a GABA-PAM, a 5-HT1A receptor partial agonist, buspirone, a glutamate voltage-gated calcium channel blocker, gabapentin or pregabalin, or a histamine receptor antagonist, or to some or all of them? In the case of medications for psychosis, focusing on what are referred to as second-generation antipsychotics, are we referring to a dopamine and serotonin receptor antagonist? It expands our psychopharmacological vocabulary as it enables combinations of 11 pharmacological domains and 10 modes of action, and is able to accommodate new discoveries. For example, if a new target or a new mode of is identified, NBN can be expanded in a meaningful way to address and incorporate such new developments. A certain limitation of NBN is that in many cases neither the exact nor the mode of action that is relevant to the therapeutic effect is entirely clear. However, from the outset, NBN aims to reflect the contemporary pharmacological knowledge base and to acknowledge its limitations in representing the ultimate knowledge which is reached at through years of hard work, effort and research. Moreover, the NBN is designed as a living document which can and will be updated yearly as new developments emerge and new medications are approved. A major limitation that NBN reflects is not having some fixed combination of some sort. This actually reflects the generally negative view of the committee regarding this type of prescribing practice. This task force has to deal with omissions like that of many of the brand names are missing, possible critical drug interactions, data on activity at cytochromes, etc. However, the task force encourages our colleagues to send feedback via the NBN app and acknowledges Collective Colleagues' Wisdom (CCW) as a major asset to shape and to constantly improve the system of nomenclature. A further limitation is that, in its current form, the NBM focuses on psychopharmacology, while other brain-related medications, such as medications for epilepsy, chronic pain, moving disorders, excessive daytime sleepiness, and narcolepsy, didn't find a mention there. The task force recognizes this gap, and a special committee was recently established to work on these neuropharmacological medications. Further, the NBN focuses on adult psychopharmacology. The need to address the specific aspects of the pediatric population is not addressed in the NBN in its current form. To respond to this gap, a pediatric section has been established. The level of evidence is not the same for the 4 dimensions of NBN. The first approved indication is essentially based on the regulatory decisions of different national or international bodies. The second and third dimensions, efficacy and side effects practical notes, reflect the options and interpretations of the task force on clinical issues, as well as other forms of data types, like empirical ones. Side effects were included only if they were prevalent, more than 10%, or life-changing or life-threatening. The practical notes comprise clinical knowledge that has filtered through practice by means of the task force clinical sieve, presented in a nutshell. The fourth dimension, neurobiology, reflects empirical data which will be updated together with other sections of the NBN on a regular basis. The scope is to harness NBN to help clinicians in their decisions regarding the next rational psychopharmacology step. The intention is to provide a comprehensive and coherent naming system that clarifies the rationale for prescription and hence might increase adherence. Feedback from our colleagues will be an important component in updating and fine-tuning of NBN. Contributors Joseph Soha designed the concept, collected the data, coordinated the meetings, and wrote the paper. He reviewed several drafts of this paper, made comments, and directly contributed to the final version of this paper. Conclusion. As Voll and colleagues point out, this does not mean to say the identified relationships are not valid, though some may be false, but the significance of the correlation is perhaps being exaggerated. This is most prominent in the potential use of fMRI as a means of lie detection. An observation is made regarding all the activity of human brain, and an assumption was cut out of that observation so that someone observing can easily get the better of thought process. With that reference, an observation is made about the activity of the brain, from which an assumption is made that the observer can know the thought process that have led to that change, as opposed to forward interference, in which the participant is given a known stimulus and the impact on brain response is then noted. There is general consensus that under controlled laboratory conditions, some areas of the brain are more active when the subject is instructed to lie than when they are disclosing the truth. The correlation loses its significance, but when some movement is noticed in the sections that are attached with lying and continue to consider the subject is not honest. It may be that other processes can lead to similar patterns of response within the brain. This research field is saturated with bigger validation, which would be a much better practice to understand reverse interference 19 data as offering a percentage probability of a client's truthfulness rather than a stark affirmation that they are or are not lying. The interpretation of such experiments has already been discussed at considerable length previously. It is worth mentioning at this point that even though the readiness potential appears to be a true phenomenon, but there are different views about its significance. Adina Roski's critics continually persuade me that the certain constraints of such experiments actually means that they aren't offering the insights into the timing and control of volitional actions implied by the determinists. The failure to adequately distinguish between measurement of when to act and whether to act, the potential difference between conscious intent and consciousness of conscious intent, and the inability to probe decisions made after a long period of deliberation all leave open the reality of free will